Hey guys, tonight we wander together into the flickering lamplight of 19th century New York, when the glow of Broadway gas lamps revealed far more than respectable shopfronts and strolling families. You move along the wooden sidewalks, your shoes tapping in rhythm with the clatter of carriage wheels and the occasional neigh of a horse. The smell is a strange mix. Roasted chestnuts from a street cart, horse manure steaming in the gutters, and faint perfume drifting from a doorway that suddenly swings shut when you look. You probably won't survive this place if you expect Victorian manners to keep things neat. It's a city of shadows and secrets, and those lamps don't light every corner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on Broadway near Canal Street, where the lamps hiss softly as gas hurries through pipes beneath the pavement. Imagine it, the largest city in America by the mid-1800s, population surging past 500,000. And with every new face came more energy, more need, and yes, more opportunity for industries people didn't talk about in polite drawing rooms. Broadway at night is no less lively than during the day. In fact, some say it's livelier. Theatres flash their billboards, oyster cellars glow beneath street level, and respectable couples hurry past doorways they pretend not to see. The mainstream historical fact is clear enough. By the 1850s, New York had earned the nickname the City of Sin from European visitors who marveled not just at its commerce and crowds, but at its open secret, the prevalence of prostitution in nearly every ward. You picture rows of houses with candles in the windows, each a subtle code, while cabmen knew exactly which streets to linger on for late-night fares. A quirky tidbit catches your ear as you overhear two passers-by joke about gaslight girls. This wasn't slang invented for fun, but a real phrase whispered in newspapers and taverns, referring to the women who worked corners illuminated by those lamps. Some claimed the glow made faces look softer, prettier, hiding blemishes, while others said the lampposts gave just enough light for negotiation, but not enough to risk recognition. Historians still argue whether the arrival of gaslight truly changed the scale of prostitution in the city, or if it simply made the trade more visible to moral reformers who suddenly found themselves able to point, quite literally, to the problem. Was the issue growing, or was it just better lit? The debate lingers like the hiss of the flame itself. You continue southward, and the sensory world thickens. A newsboy shouts headlines about the latest scandal, the press feasting on tales of fallen women. You pass a German beer hall, windows fogged from laughter and smoke. A gentleman in a tall hat stumbles out, arm linked with a woman whose dress hem trails through a puddle. She glances at you with the sort of confidence that comes from being both seen and unseen. And yet, there's humour in the air too. You catch a joke from a nearby group. Broadway's better lit than my marriage bed. A chuckle rolls through them, and you can't help but smirk at how human it all feels. Beneath the judgments, this is still a city of people muddling through their nights, searching for warmth, pleasure, or just distraction from the weight of the day. As the lamps flicker, your eyes adjust to the pattern of shadows. You realize that every block tells two stories, the respectable storefront and the whispered transaction in its doorway. You walk on, feeling the uneven boards beneath your feet, the faint chill of river breezes threading through alleyways. Somewhere behind you, a carriage clatters to a halt, laughter spills out, and another night in New York slips further into memory. You slip away from Broadway's half-polished facade and descend into the crooked veins of 5 Points, where the respectable glow of lamps doesn't quite reach. The air thickens here, heavier with coal smoke, sewage, and the sour tang of spilled beer. The wooden walkways sag under your steps, and the buildings lean inward as if conspiring to block out the moon. You hear the faint scrape of a fiddle through a cracked window, someone stomping a makeshift dance upstairs, and below it all, the steady murmur of voices making bargains in the dark. By the mid-1800s, 5 Points had become notorious, part slum, part carnival, part cautionary tale. The mainstream fact is this: thousands of immigrants, mostly Irish and German, packed into dilapidated tenements, often 6 or 7 to a room, with water trickling down walls and straw mattresses crawling with lice. Out of such desperation, brothels bloomed like stubborn weeds. They weren't the velvet-draped parlours of uptown. These were shadowy rooms carved out of basements, back halls and upper stories. And here's your quirky tidbit. One journalist in the 1840s wrote that you could toss a stone in 5 Points and hit a brothel before it hit the ground. He may have exaggerated, but only slightly. At the height of its reputation, this neighbourhood boasted dozens upon dozens of houses, from shabby cribs, where women rented space by the hour, to larger disorderly houses overseen by madams who took their cut in exchange for protection. Historians still argue whether 5 Points was truly the most dangerous neighborhood in America, or whether sensational press and reformer panic exaggerated its vices. Was it the heart of sin, or simply an easy scapegoat for a city nervous about immigrants? The debate continues, though the neighborhood's reputation remains legendary. You push past a knot of barefoot children playing dice in the gutter. Their laughter carries, though their clothes are rags. A woman in a faded shawl beckons from a doorway, eyes ringed with fatigue. Inside you glimpse peeling wallpaper, a single candle guttering against draughts, and a bed whose sheets have seen more strangers than soap. The price? Perhaps a nickel, perhaps a loaf of bread. There's humour here, too, though dark. A man on the stoop mutters, "Even the rats pay rent in this place," before swigging cheap gin. Another laughs so hard he drops his hat in the muck. Somehow, amid all this squalor, people still find ways to joke, to keep the weight from crushing them entirely. Further in, you encounter a saloon that doubles as a dance hall. The fiddler's bow screeches, and men clap in rhythm while women spin with forced smiles, their skirts brushing against rough boots. This isn't entertainment in the Broadway sense. It's survival, masked as merriment. The men drink away pay earned on the docks. The women hope for a paying customer before dawn. The sounds close in on you, arguments breaking out, a glass shattering, a lullaby sung in Irish to a baby who can't sleep in a room with 20 others. Your steps feel heavy, as though the very ground of 5 Points is sticky with spilled ale and stories best left untold. Yet you can't look away. The neighborhood is alive, pulsing with energy, and every corner offers a new glimpse into how necessity carves its own economy. You pause in a narrow alley. Overhead, laundry lines crisscross the sky, sagging with damp clothes. Beneath them, a woman argues with a man over a few coins. Her voice is sharp, his defensive. The exchange ends with him stomping off, and her pocketing the change with a sigh. No one else reacts. These dealings are as common as breathing here. And as you pull back toward the main street, you can't help but notice the rhythm of the place. Brothels rise where churches fail, jokes bloom where hope shrinks, and life, however precarious, continues. You step into the night again, carrying the echo of 5 Points in your ears, the fiddle, the laughter, and the weary whisper of survival. You climb out of 5 Points' shadowed alleys and drift into a different sort of nighttime world, a playground for men with coin to spare, the so-called sporting men. These fellows, usually young, restless, and flush with money from business, shipping, or law, treat the city after dark like a hunting ground. Their prey isn't deer in the forest or trout in the Hudson. It's company, laughter, and the thrill of an illicit rendezvous. You spot them easily, polished boots, coats cut by the newest tailors, cigars clamped between teeth. They swagger into saloons where gaslight bounces off gilt mirrors, where the air smells of whiskey, tobacco, and roast oysters. The roar of conversation fills the room, punctuated by the clink of glasses and the shuffle of playing cards. You slip inside one such hall, the floor sticky with spilled porter, the ceiling haze thick with pipe smoke. Here's the mainstream historical fact. By the 1840s and 1850s, gambling dens and saloons were not just tolerated but woven into the fabric of New York nightlife. Many of these establishments doubled as brothel recruiting grounds where women mingled freely with men at card tables or in back rooms. Sporting men cultivated reputations for indulgence. They even published their exploits in memoirs later, as if debauchery were a badge of honor. The quirky tidbit. In some clubs, oysters were as essential as whiskey. They were cheap, plentiful from New York Harbor, and thought to be an aphrodisiac. Picture a room full of rowdy young men slurping oysters by the dozen, boasting about their luck at cards, then slipping away upstairs with a companion. Shells first, shame later, one wag joked, and the line stuck. Historians still argue whether the rise of sporting culture reflected a decline in traditional family morals or simply the new visibility of male leisure. Was it truly a moral collapse or just a shift in where men spent their free time once urban entertainment exploded? The answer drifts like smoke in these halls, impossible to pin down. You linger at a poker table, the stakes rise, coins clatter into the pot, and one player slams down a full house to the groans of the others. A woman in scarlet silk leans over his shoulder, whispering into his ear. Is she here for the thrill of cards? Maybe, but most likely she's here for business of another kind, scouting for a client with money to lose and money still left over. The atmosphere brims with humor. A drunk stumbles into the room and declares, "I only came here to pray." The crowd erupts in laughter. Another adds, "You're in the wrong church, friend. Our choir sings in whiskey." You can't help but chuckle, even as you notice a pair of police officers outside the door, turning away with studied indifference. Everyone knows what happens inside, and everyone knows who is being paid to let it happen. You step through to the back. The noise softens. Velvet curtains mark off private booths, and behind them you catch glimpses of whispered negotiations. A man offers a woman a necklace for her time instead of coin. Another slips a folded bill into a palm. The room hums with arrangements made without contracts, yet binding in their own way. And through it all you feel the strange duality. In the front room, laughter, boasting and camaraderie. In the back, transactions that shift the city's unspoken economy. The sporting men will return to their offices in the morning, wives none the wiser, while the women vanish back into streets, cribs, or parlor houses depending on their station. As you leave, the saloon door swings shut, muffling the raucous chorus of voices. Out on the street, the night feels quieter, though only for a moment. You know another den lies just down the block, another table, another bottle, another night where money and desire collide under the same smoky ceiling. You drift further uptown, away from the clatter of saloons and the damp tenements, and step into a quieter street where the buildings stand taller, their facades freshly painted, their curtains drawn tight against prying eyes. Here, the houses don't look like dens of vice. They look almost respectable. A brass knocker shines on one door, a pair of lace curtains frames another, and a lamp glows gently in the window as if to say, "Welcome, but only if you know where to knock." This is the world of the so-called parlor houses, the high-class brothels that offered their clients something closer to the illusion of refinement than the raw transaction you witnessed in 5 Points. A mainstream historical fact is that some of these establishments were run like boarding houses, complete with parlors decorated in velvet drapes, pianos in the corner, and fine china on the shelves. Wealthy men wanted not just company, but the performance of elegance, and these houses delivered. Your quirky tidbit arrives as you glance at a pianoforte in one such parlor, its keys gleaming in the lamplight. A visitor's guide from the 1850s claimed that certain houses even staged musical evenings, where the women would sing sentimental ballads before retiring upstairs with guests. Imagine the scene, businessmen applauding politely while already calculating which singer they might request afterward. Culture and commerce twine together with a straight face. Historians still argue whether these parlor houses represented an attempt to civilize prostitution or simply to disguise it more effectively. Was this about elevating women's dignity within the trade, or just about charging higher fees by draping the same old business in velvet and sheet music? The debate lingers in scholarly circles, a tug of war between optimism and cynicism. You settle into one of the parlours, sinking into a cushioned chair. The wallpaper shows floral patterns and oil paintings hang in gilt frames. A woman in a carefully tailored gown enters, her hair pinned with pearls. She greets you not with the brashness of a streetwalker, but with the ease of a hostess. You might almost believe you've come for tea, were it not for the knowing glance in her eyes. The clientele here are different too. You overhear a lawyer boasting about a case he won, a banker murmuring about the latest stock price, a politician lowering his voice when he sees you watching. These men pay not only for intimacy, but for privacy in rooms where secrets can be spoken and conveniently forgotten. And there's humour, even here. One guest laughs that he prefers these parlours because at least the curtains match the carpet. The women roll their eyes, but they laugh too, well practised in humouring men who think themselves clever. The joke, like the whiskey, flows smoothly, leaving no mark by morning. In the corner, a clock ticks softly, and the whole room feels suspended, as if outside time. The noises of the street fade away. Here you are in a bubble of performance, each role carefully played. The hostess pours wine, the pianist plinks a tune, and clients relax into the fantasy of a home away from home, one without judgment where every indulgence is cloaked in velvet. When you finally step back outside, the night air hits cooler on your face, and the sound of carriage wheels returns. You glance back at the house, quiet, still, respectable. To a passerby it is no different from its neighbours. But you know now what lies inside, a theatre of propriety masking transactions that in truth hold the city together as tightly as any bank or courthouse. The further you wander from velvet parlours and gilt mirrors, the starker the city becomes. You duck into a side street lined with rickety wooden shacks, their roofs sagging under years of neglect, their doors barely hanging from rusted hinges. Here no illusions of refinement exist. The women who work these places aren't playing the piano or pouring wine. They're hustling for the barest coins, for meals, for survival. These are the cribs and dives, the lowest rung of New York's sex trade in the 19th century. A mainstream historical fact is that cribs were often just single rooms, barely large enough for a bed, with women renting them by the night or even by the hour. They'd sit by the door, waiting, sometimes calling out to men as they passed. Cheap liquor joints nearby fueled the trade, each bottle lowering a man's standards as the night dragged on. Your quirky tidbit comes from one reformer's shocked account. In some dives, services were exchanged not for money, but for food, coal, or even a place to sleep by the stove. One woman supposedly accepted loaves of stale bread as payment, her stomach more desperate than her purse. The detail is both absurd and heartbreaking, a reminder that survival often outweighs dignity. Historians still argue whether such stories were exaggerated to fuel reform campaigns, or whether conditions truly sank that low. Did reformers dramatize the hunger for sex exchange to stir public outrage, or were the bread-for-bed stories grimly real? The truth may lie somewhere in between, flickering like the candle stubs that barely lit those rooms. You step into one of the dives, the smell nearly knocks you back. Sweat, sour beer, unwashed sheets. A cracked mirror hangs crooked on the wall, reflecting faces that look older than their years. A woman leans on the doorframe, dress torn at the hem, her voice hoarse as she asks if you've got a dime. Behind her, the bed creaks as another customer stumbles out, buttoning his coat without looking back. Laughter cuts through the gloom, though, sharp and unexpected. A group of sailors, pockets nearly empty after too many rounds of cheap gin, joke that the mattresses here are flatter than the East River. One shouts, "At least it doesn't move as much." The women roll their eyes, accustomed to humour as a shield against despair. For a moment, the room feels almost human, just people making do, laughing where they can. As you move along the row of cribs, you notice the women's strategies. Some lean boldly into the street, calling out with exaggerated smiles. Others sit silently, eyes heavy, letting desperation do the work. Candles burn low in tin holders, casting shadows that make each doorway look like the mouth of a cave. and yet amid the misery there's a pulse of life. A fiddler plays outside one dive, the tune jaunty despite the squalor. A child sleeps in a corner wrapped in an old coat, his mother humming softly between customers. The scene is jarring, heartbreaking, and oddly tender all at once, a reminder that even here, in the lowest cribs, humanity refuses to disappear entirely. When you step back into the night air, the contrast hits hard. The city hums, alive with wealth and commerce just a few streets away. But here, survival is measured in dimes, crusts of bread, and a bed that doesn't collapse before dawn. You walk on, the laughter of sailors and the hum of a mother's lullaby echoing behind you, etched into the dark corners of New York's story. You leave behind the rows of cribs and stumble into a different atmosphere altogether. Here, the air feels heavier with perfume than with smoke, and the laughter carries with a sharper edge of command. You've stepped into the world of the madam, the women who ran the houses, part businesswoman, part disciplinarian, part entertainer, and, in many cases, part politician. A mainstream historical fact, by the 1850s, some of the most powerful madams in New York were not simply tolerated but quietly respected, at least by those who relied on their coin. They kept order in their houses, paid off police when necessary, and sometimes even secured protection from politicians who enjoyed their establishments after hours. One reformer bitterly noted that these women had the ear of men in power bought by velvet and gold. Your quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a visitor's observation. Some madams printed calling cards, as if they were respectable shopkeepers. Imagine being handed a neat little card that read, "Mrs. So-and-so House of Entertainment, discreet location." A sly wink of legitimacy in a world built on secrecy. Historians still argue whether these women should be seen as early entrepreneurs or as exploiters of the women under them. Were they savvy business leaders carving out power in a society that denied women most avenues of independence? Or were they simply shifting the balance of exploitation, profiting off desperation with better furniture and fancier dresses? The debate still stirs scholarly circles. You sit in the parlour of one such house, and the authority of the madam is palpable. She sweeps through the room in a gown of deep burgundy silk, her voice low but commanding. The girls stand a little straighter when she enters. She greets her clients warmly, but there's steel beneath the smile. She knows names, stories, debts, and secrets, and she guards them like currency. At the far end, a group of men chuckle over cigars. One tells a joke about marriage being the most expensive subscription service in the city. The madame laughs politely, but you notice how quickly her eyes flick to the door, checking arrivals, gauging which client might be trouble. Humour may oil the wheels, but vigilance keeps the house running. The room itself mirrors her authority, plush rugs on the floor, gas lamps trimmed to a warm glow, a decanter of brandy waiting on the table. The madame manages not only the women, but the illusion of luxury. Every cushion, every candle is part of the theatre that convinces men they've stepped into a special realm, a break from the grime outside. You overhear her whispering to one of her girls about a new dress, the cost of lace, and whether the tailor can be trusted to keep quiet. This is management, balancing expenses, keeping appearances, and always ensuring the client's return. It's a fragile ecosystem, and the madam sits at its centre. And yet behind her polished veneer, there's something raw. You wonder what path brought her here. Was she once one of the women climbing her way up by force of will? Did she inherit the house from another madam who aged out? Historians speculate, but rarely know for sure, because the records that survive tend to focus on scandal, not personal stories. When you step back into the night, you can still feel the weight of her gaze on your shoulders, as though she knew not just who you were, but what you carried with you. The madam's world is one of velvet curtains, but behind them lies iron discipline, and a business sense sharper than any banker's quill. You carry the echo of the madam's velvet parlour with you, as you step closer to the docks where the air grows damp with salt water and thick with accents from faraway lands. The voices here don't sound like Broadway's polished chatter. Instead, you catch the lilt of Irish brogues, the guttural tones of German, and even the hesitant English of girls just arrived from rural Europe. The mainstream historical fact is clear enough. By the mid-19th century, waves of immigration poured into New York, especially from Ireland, during the famine years of the 1840s. Many young women arrived alone or with little family support, and with few employment options beyond domestic service or factory work, prostitution became one of the harsh realities of survival. Reformers counted hundreds, sometimes thousands, of immigrant women among the city's public women. A quirky tidbit drifts your way in the form of a nickname. Irish women in the trade were sometimes referred to mockingly as Bridgets, a stereotype drawn from the common domestic servant name. Newspapers sneered at Bridget in the kitchen by day, Bridget in the parlour by night, a cruel slur that reveals just how thin the line could be between service work and sex work when wages fell short. Historians still argue whether immigrant women entered prostitution primarily through deception, lured by false job offers, or whether it was simply the brutal math of hunger and rent that pushed them in. Some evidence suggests both: letters from girls tricked with promises of sewing jobs, alongside records of widows who turned to the trade after factory wages barely bought bread. The truth, like the tide against the docks, rises and falls with perspective. You walk down a narrow street lined with boarding houses. Through an open window you see 4 women crowded around a single trunk, their dresses patched, their eyes wary. One murmurs about cleaning houses for pennies. Another, bolder, says there's more money to be had walking near the Bowery after dusk. Their debate isn't philosophical. It's immediate, practical, edged with hunger. Nearby, a German beer hall hums with energy. Laughter bursts out as mugs clink, but behind the cheer you sense negotiations unfolding at the tables. A man gestures toward a young woman, offering her drink after drink. You wonder if she came to this hall for leisure or for work, or perhaps both. In these blurred spaces, lines vanish quickly. Humour, of course, sneaks in even here. You overhear a pair of Irish dock workers teasing a friend. "Careful, Paddy, she'll charge you twice. Once for her time, and once for her accent." The woman rolls her eyes and fires back, "At least I've got one you can understand." Laughter ripples, and for a fleeting moment the exchange feels less like exploitation and more like banter at any village pub, except the stakes here are survival in a city that devours the unprepared. The streets themselves seem to hold the immigrant struggle. Laundry flaps overhead on lines stretched between windows. Children dart through puddles, speaking a mix of English and their parents' tongues. And beneath it all, the city churns, offering opportunity with one hand and danger with the other. As you step away, you pass a small church mission with its door propped open. Inside, a priest kneels in prayer, and 2 young women slip onto a bench, their shawls pulled tight. Perhaps they've come for salvation, or maybe just for a warm seat and a few quiet minutes out of the wind. You can't tell. What you do know is that their accents, their faces, their very presence here weave into the larger story of how immigration shaped not just labour and neighbourhoods, but even the underbelly of New York's nights. You step back from the docks and find yourself drifting into another layer of the city's nighttime economy, one whispered about in the reformer pamphlets and printed in scandalous headlines. The subject makes your chest tighten: the involvement of children. In the shadows of New York's 19th century streets, not all the women working the trade were fully grown. A mainstream historical fact sets the tone. Reform investigations in the 1850s and 1860s documented cases of girls as young as 12 or 13 being found in disorderly houses. Some had been lured with promises of domestic work, some were runaways, and some had been born into households already steeped in poverty and vice. Though the numbers are impossible to pin down, the very existence of such cases shocked even the most jaded New Yorkers. Your quirky tidbit arrives through the pages of a newspaper that tried to spin scandal into wit. One editor sneered about the city's lost lambs, and another coined the phrase infantile depravity, as if branding the horror with catchy language somehow softened it. It didn't. Reformers quoted such headlines back at the public, horrified that humour had been made from tragedy. Historians still argue whether child prostitution was widespread or whether sensationalist reporting exaggerated isolated cases. Some scholars insist it was alarmingly common, especially in poorer districts, while others caution that reformers may have amplified the issue to stir outrage and donations for their causes. The truth likely falls somewhere in between, too frequent to ignore, yet often framed through moral panic. You walk down a narrow lane and spot a figure no taller than your shoulder, hair tangled, dress far too thin for the chill. She leans against a doorway, eyes darting nervously at each passerby. Her voice, when she speaks, carries more weariness than youth. A man stumbles toward her, coins already clinking in his hand, and you feel your stomach twist. The scene lasts only moments, but it's burned into the memory of the street. Laughter drifts from the corner, where a group of older boys joke crudely. One of them quips, "Cheaper than a pint." The others roar, though there's an unease beneath it, as if even they sense they've crossed a line too far. Humour here is brittle, jagged, and more unsettling than amusing. It serves as armour against the ugliness of what they witness. Inside a nearby tenement, you glimpse a different story. A girl sits by the hearth, head on her knees, while an older woman, perhaps a mother, perhaps a madam, speaks sharply to her. You can't hear the words, but you can feel the tension, the negotiation of youth as commodity. In a city where survival trumps sentiment, innocence can be treated like currency. Yet amid the bleakness, you also hear voices of resistance. Reformers from the Children's Aid Society distribute leaflets warning men of eternal damnation if they ruin the young. A Protestant minister preaches in the street, his voice shaking as he declares, "These are daughters, not merchandise." Whether anyone listens is another matter, but the attempt itself is a flicker of light. As you retreat from that block, the sights and sounds weigh heavier than the drunken laughter of saloons or even the squalor of cribs. It is one thing to see adults negotiating survival. It is another to glimpse children caught in the same net. The gaslights ahead blur slightly, as if the city itself doesn't want you to see too clearly, preferring its darkest truths to stay half-hidden. You leave behind the uneasy hush of back alleys and head toward the waterfront, where the night hums with an entirely different rhythm. The East River laps against the piers, ropes creak against wooden posts, and the smell of tar, salt, and fish fills your lungs. Here, ships tower like dark skeletons in the lamplight, their sails furled, their decks quiet, until payday. For sailors and soldiers, this stretch of New York is a temporary paradise, a place to spend wages quickly before the tide carries them away again. The mainstream historical fact is simple enough. Sailors on leave, along with soldiers garrisoned nearby, provided a steady stream of customers for the sex trade. Harbour districts always did, from London's Docklands to San Francisco's Barbary Coast, and New York was no exception. In fact, reformers estimated that on payday weekends, entire blocks near the piers transformed into one continuous brothel, a chorus of laughter, music, and drunken bargaining. Your quirky tidbit comes from a traveller's journal noting that some sailors referred to prostitutes as shore-leave wives. The term carried a strange logic. Temporary, transactional, but framed with a veneer of domesticity. A man might joke, "I'm married till the tide turns," while boasting about his night ashore. It was humour, tinged with melancholy, though the sailors rarely admitted it. Historians still argue whether this sailor economy primarily exploited the women, or whether it offered them rare advantages, steady pay, little pretense, and an escape from wealthier clients who carried more danger in their respectability. Some scholars suggest the transactional bluntness of sailors made these encounters oddly straightforward, almost cleaner than the whispered promises of uptown parlours. Others see it only as another form of exploitation, just sped up by the ticking clock of the tide. You pause at the entrance of a waterfront tavern. The doors swing wide and you're hit with a wave of sound, fiddles shrieking, boots pounding on the floorboards, men singing off-key. The room is hot with sweat and tobacco, and women weave through the crowd, their dresses snagging on benches, their voices raised above the din. One grabs a sailor's cap and places it on her own head, sending the room into laughter. He bows theatrically, declaring, "She's the captain now." The cheer that follows is so loud it rattles the bottles on the shelf. You push deeper into the tavern, the crowd pressing close. At one table, a soldier in uniform tosses coins like confetti, while a woman scoops them up with practiced speed. At another, a pair dance clumsily, knocking into chairs, uncaring of the chaos they cause. This is joy lived in fast forward. Money in one hand, whiskey in the other, desire negotiated in the third hour of a binge, and yet you notice the shadows too. A woman leans against the wall, arms crossed, watching the sailors swirl past her. Her smile is tight, her eyes scanning for opportunity, but also for trouble. A fight breaks out near the door, two men swinging fists over who saw her first. The barkeep barely glances up, sliding another pint down the bar, as though brawls are as common as spilled ale. There's humour, but it's raw. One sailor jokes that the tavern floor has more fleas than his hammock at sea. Another retorts, "At least the fleas here don't bite till morning." The table erupts, and for a moment even the women laugh, though their eyes quickly return to business. When you finally step back into the cool night air, the noise muffles behind the tavern's doors, replaced by the slosh of the river. You catch sight of a woman and a sailor disappearing into a side alley, his arm draped around her shoulder, his laughter loud. By dawn he'll be back aboard ship and she'll return to her corner of the city, two lives intersecting only in this sliver of night. The tide of soldiers and sailors ebbs and flows, but the rhythm never changes. Ships arrive, wages are spent, and New York's waterfront becomes, for a few hours, a theatre of reckless indulgence under the gaslight. You leave the docks behind, but the sound of fiddles and drunken song still clings to your ears. Heading northward, you enter a quieter street where the flicker of lamps reveals a different kind of bustle, not of revelry, but of reform. Here stand clusters of earnest men and women, their coats buttoned to the chin, their hands heavy with pamphlets. They move from doorway to doorway, knocking gently, offering tracts and speaking in hushed but urgent voices. The mainstream historical fact is clear. The 19th century saw the rise of moral reform societies in New York dedicated to rescuing what they called fallen women. Groups like the New York Female Moral Reform Society campaigned to shut down brothels, distribute religious literature, and offer alternatives, domestic service, sewing work, or entry into reform homes. At their height, they boasted thousands of members, mostly middle-class women determined to clean up their city. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some reformers used coded umbrellas as signals. A woman holding a white umbrella might mark herself as available for rescue conversations, standing outside theatres or brothels, waiting to intercept women as they entered. Imagine that, a patch of white, bobbing through the gaslit crowd like a mobile lighthouse of judgment. Historians still argue whether these reform movements truly helped or harmed. Did they provide genuine alternatives for desperate women, or simply impose middle-class morality on lives that had no room for it? Were the sewing workshops they promoted a lifeline, or another cage, just with cleaner sheets and stricter rules? The debate continues, echoing in academic journals as much as it did in church basements. You step closer to one such gathering. A woman in a bonnet presses a pamphlet into your hand. Its title screams in bold type, "Sin No More, a Guide to Purity and Salvation." She looks at you with a mixture of pity and sternness, as though your very presence here marks you as suspect. Behind her, a man preaches from a makeshift podium, his voice cracking as he warns of hellfire. A crowd has gathered, some listening earnestly, others smirking at the spectacle. One passerby mutters, "They hand out tracts like bakers hand out rolls." His friend laughs, adding, "At least the rolls fill your stomach." Even in the midst of sermons, humour punctures the heaviness. The reformers pretend not to hear, though their shoulders stiffen. You follow a group into a mission house lit by oil lamps. Inside, a stark contrast awaits. Plain wooden benches, walls whitewashed and bare, a small Bible resting open on a lectern. Women sit in silence, their faces weary, while a reform matron speaks about redemption through hard work and prayer. In the corner, a pile of donated dresses waits, each one drab but serviceable. You imagine a woman trading silk ribbons for cotton aprons, champagne for sewing needles, and you wonder if that feels like salvation or punishment. The reformers mean well, or so they believe. Their eyes burn with conviction and their pockets empty into donation boxes. But you sense the tension in the room. The women shifting in their seats, the matron's sharp glances, the unspoken reality that not everyone here came willingly. Some were dragged in by police during raids, others pushed by family shame, others simply too tired to argue. When you step back outside, the street feels colder, sharper. A group of young men snicker as they pass, mocking the reformers in sing-song voices. "Repent, repent, but not till I've spent." The rhyme earns a roar of laughter, and even you can't help but smirk at their irreverence. The reformers press on, faces grim, umbrellas raised like banners of virtue against the tide. The night city swallows their voices quickly, replacing sermons with the familiar hum of carriages, laughter, and whispered transactions. And yet the image lingers, the white umbrella bobbing through the dark, determined to shine a little light into corners where perhaps no one asked for it. You drift away from the reformers' umbrellas and sermons and find yourself following the faint, antiseptic tang of something sharper than perfume. The trail leads you toward a small brick building with frosted windows and a brass plate that simply reads "Physician." Inside, lamps glow dimly over rows of glass jars, shelves of tinctures, and leather chairs where nervous men fidget while waiting their turn. Here lies another shadow of New York's sex trade, the constant, gnawing fear of disease. The mainstream historical fact is unavoidable. Venereal disease was rampant in the 19th century, particularly syphilis and gonorrhea. Medical journals of the time openly fretted about their spread, especially among soldiers, sailors, and the city's working-class men. By mid-century, doctors estimated that tens of thousands of New Yorkers were infected, though no one dared publish exact figures. Brothels became, in reformers' words, seedbeds of contagion, though the reality was that the entire system of clandestine encounters carried risk. Your quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a supposed cure. Some physicians, lacking antibiotics of course, resorted to mercury treatments. Yes, mercury. Patients were told to smear ointments on sores, gargle solutions, or endure fumes in sealed rooms. One wag in the papers joked, "A man might survive his disease, but not the doctor's cure." It was dark humor, but it spread almost as quickly as the rumors of contagion. Historians still argue whether prostitution was truly the primary driver of these epidemics or whether it was simply the most convenient scapegoat. Was the disease born in brothels, or was it circulating just as readily through respectable liaisons hidden under the veil of marriage and mistresses? The debate continues, hinting at the hypocrisy of a society eager to blame women while excusing the men who visited them. You linger near the physician's chair as a man in a fine waistcoat whispers his symptoms. His face flushes red as the doctor nods gravely and begins scribbling notes. The woman who waits behind him shifts uncomfortably, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes darting to the door as though calculating whether she should flee before her name is called. The shame weighs heavier than the illness. Outside, you overhear jokes drifting from a group of apprentices loitering near a tavern. "Caught a French lesson last night," one says, grinning. Another adds, "Hope you paid for a cure too." The laughter rings out, careless, even cruel. Humour becomes a shield here, as if mocking the disease could ward it off. But the worry in their eyes betrays the truth. Walking further down the street, you pass a chemist's shop where bottles of dubious tonics line the window. Labels promise purity restored and secret remedies, though most contain little more than alcohol and herbs. Still, desperate men buy them, clutching at hope in a bottle. Women, too, slip inside discreetly, seeking relief, though the shame they carry out often outweighs the meagre results. And then you recall the debates simmering in medical journals. Should the city regulate prostitution, forcing women to undergo inspections as was done in some European cities? Reformers said yes, others said no, and in the end, nothing systematic took root. New York continued with its blindfold on, pretending vice was invisible until disease made it impossible to ignore. As you step away from the physician's office, the chill of the night feels sharper. Gas lamps hiss overhead, but their glow cannot erase the uneasy truth. Beneath the laughter of saloons and the velvet of parlour houses lies a constant undertow of sickness spreading silently through the veins of the city. And though doctors claimed authority, their cures often harmed as much as they helped, leaving patients to wonder whether the remedy or the sin was more dangerous. You step out of the doctor's dim chambers and back onto the cobbled street, but the smell of mercury and tinctures seems to cling to your coat. A few blocks on, another figure catches your eye. Not a doctor this time, but a policeman leaning against a lamp-post with his cap tipped low. He smokes lazily, watching the door of a house where the curtains glow faintly red. A man slips inside. The officer doesn't move. Then a few minutes later, another man comes out and presses something into the officer's hand, the glint of coin. The officer pockets it without breaking his stance. This is the world of police complicity, and it's as much a part of New York's prostitution history as gaslight or velvet chairs. A mainstream historical fact is that by the mid-19th century, many policemen were paid to look the other way. Reformers railed that prostitution thrived not because the city was powerless, but because it was profitable for those sworn to uphold the law. Entire precincts were rumored to take cuts from brothels, ensuring raids were staged for show rather than substance. Your quirky tidbit slips from the lips of a passing cabman. The badge is just another ticket to the parlour. Some joked that policemen were like unofficial doormen, steering clients towards certain houses that had already paid for their protection. It became common knowledge that knocking too loudly on a door might draw a neighbour's complaint, but never a cop's, so long as the weekly envelope was delivered. Historians still argue whether corruption was systemic or merely scattered. Was the police force itself rotten at the core, or were only certain officers willing to pocket hush money? Records of disciplinary hearings suggest both. Some men dismissed for taking bribes, others quietly shuffled into new precincts without charges. The truth remains muddled, much like the blurred line between law and vice on these streets. You follow the officer as he ambles down the block. He tips his hat to a madam standing in her doorway, and she returns the gesture with a smile sharp enough to cut. Inside, the laughter of clients rises faintly, but no one fears interruption. The transaction has already been secured, the law reduced to a silent partner in the business. Humour drifts out from a nearby saloon where men jeer, "Coppers only chase you if you don't pay 'em first." Another adds, "They'll cuff you for stealing a loaf, but not for stealing a night." The laughter is rough, but the truth behind it stings. In this city, justice is often for sale and everyone knows the price. You turn a corner and find a scene more dramatic. A raid is underway, or at least it looks like one. Officers pound on a door, burst inside, and march out a handful of women, their shawls pulled over their heads. The crowd gathers, cheering, jeering, pointing fingers. Yet you can't help but notice the brothel across the street, just as lively as before, untouched. The women hauled away tonight were likely from a house that forgot or refused to pay its dues. The raid is more performance than punishment, theatre for the reformers who will read about it in tomorrow's paper. When the spectacle ends, the crowd disperses, muttering. Some believe justice has been done, others, more cynical, shake their heads knowingly. You walk on, feeling the strange rhythm of a city where the law is flexible, bent by money and influence, where policemen guard not virtue, but profit margins. The lamplight seems dimmer now, not because the gas has weakened, but because you see too clearly how easily shadows are bought and sold. And as the officer disappears into the fog, his coin purse a little heavier, you realize that in 19th century New York, the line between guardian and accomplice was no brighter than the flicker of a lamp in the night. You drift away from the patrolman's quiet deal and let your feet carry you toward the glow of another kind of stage, this time a literal one. The theatre district of 19th century New York buzzes with energy, carriages pulling up to gaslit entrances, well-dressed couples stepping down onto red carpets, ushers calling out showtimes. But step behind the curtain and you'll find a mingling of two worlds, actresses and courtesans, performers and prostitutes, their lives often overlapping until no one can tell where the play ends and reality begins. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward. Many actresses of the time were suspected, or outright accused, of supplementing their meagre stage wages with offstage arrangements. Acting carried a whiff of scandal already, and theatre managers sometimes quietly tolerated or even encouraged the mingling of actresses with wealthy patrons. The boundary between courtesan and starlet blurred under the stage lights, making the theatre a recruiting ground for both romance and transaction. Your quirky tidbit twinkles in the gaslight. In the 1840s, some enterprising publishers sold green books, which listed not only brothels but also theatres where certain actresses were available for companionship after the final curtain. Imagine buying a guidebook that promised both Shakespearean tragedy and a rendezvous, all neatly catalogued like sightseeing attractions. Historians still argue whether the theatre truly served as a primary pipeline into sex work, or whether gossip simply painted all actresses with the same brush. Some point to letters and diaries suggesting genuine love affairs between actresses and patrons. Others insist these stories were romanticized covers for straightforward transactions. The debate flickers on, unresolved, as brightly as the footlights themselves. You slip backstage after a show. The air is thick with powder and sweat, silk gowns discarded over chairs, stage hands hammering away at props. An actress sits at her mirror, dabbing rouge from her cheeks when a gentleman in a top hat leans casually against the wall. Their conversation is quiet but unmistakable, arrangements made in half whispers, her laughter like another line from the play. In the green room, the mood is more relaxed. Actors crack jokes about missed cues, and one performer teases a colleague. You're better at winning gentlemen in the pit than on the stage. The room bursts into laughter, though the remark carries an edge of truth. Humour becomes another costume here, a mask to soften realities everyone knows but pretends not to see. The theatre itself is a study in contrasts. On stage, the audience applauds scenes of honour, tragedy, and romance. Offstage, those same patrons may slip into private boxes or follow actresses out the stage door, seeking something far less poetic. The applause masks the transactions, but only just. As you leave, you notice the posters outside, bold letters proclaiming new comedies and dramas illustrated with heroic figures and swooning heroines. Passers-by admire the artwork, but your eyes linger on the actress's smile, wondering whether she'll be entertaining again tonight, this time off stage, for a very different audience. The streets hum as the crowd disperses, men boasting of the show, women clutching their programs. But you know the real drama continues in the wings, where theatre and brothel blend seamlessly, and where every curtain call might be followed by a quieter, more personal encore. You leave the theatre's bright marquee behind, and as the crowd's chatter fades, your eyes catch flashes of silk and satin moving under the gaslight. Here, fashion itself becomes a language of the night, a code of fabrics, colours, and powders that marks out who belongs to which world. Respectable wives glide in muted tones, navy, grey, pale cream. But the women working the trade, they blaze like lanterns. A mainstream historical fact. In 19th century New York, prostitutes were often among the first women to adopt daring fashions, bright dresses, bold jewellery, and cosmetics that respectable society frowned upon. Their clothes weren't just ornament, they were advertisements, a walking signal that whispered louder than words. Your quirky tidbit sparkles like a sequin. One observer wrote with both fascination and disdain that prostitutes wore flame-coloured stockings and rouge so bright you could see it by candlelight. Another claimed some even wore wigs of vivid shades, auburn, platinum blonde, even jet black, to reinvent themselves nightly. Imagine wigs hanging on pegs like hats, each one a new identity for a new client. Historians still argue whether these fashions were self-expression or survival. Did women adopt flamboyant styles to rebel against society's restrictions, or were they simply forced to advertise louder in a competitive market? Some scholars suggest both. That beneath the painted faces was a blend of agency and necessity, tangled together like ribbons in a corset. You pause by a shop window where mannequins display shawls and bonnets. Behind you, two women laugh, their dresses bright green and crimson, their cheeks powdered. One adjusts her bodice with practiced ease, while the other teases the darker the night, the brighter the dress. Their humour is quick, self-aware. A passerby mutters disapproval, but the women only laugh louder, their skirts swishing as they move on. On another street, a woman slips into the shadows, her plain cloak wrapped tight around her shoulders. But when she passes under a lamppost, the cloak parts just enough to reveal silk peeking beneath. She blends by day, dazzles by night, a chameleon navigating survival in a city that demands both invisibility and spectacle. You overhear men joking crudely. Paint on the lips, paint on the cheeks, but not a brush on the floorboards. They laugh, tipping their hats, convinced they're clever. The women ignore them. Humour can sting, but it can also glance off like water on wax. After all, the joke is only half theirs. The women know they hold the power of allure, no matter who sneers. As you walk, the sensory details crowd in. The smell of rosewater mingles with cheap gin, silk hems drag through puddles, glittering with street grime. Boots clack over cobblestones, while laughter drifts into the night. Fashion here is not frivolous, it's survival stitched into fabric, pinned with brooches, brushed on with rouge. By the time you turn a corner, you've seen every variation. Wigs piled high, corsets laced tight, stockings in shocking colours, and shawls pulled low to mask painted lips. The city is a catwalk of contradictions, respectability and rebellion, disguise and declaration, all striding under the same hissing gas lamps. And as you move on, you realize that in 19th century New York, clothing was more than fabric. It was armor, theater, and advertisement, all at once. You wander further uptown, the hum of laughter and silk fading into the steady toll of church bells. Sunday morning has arrived. The same city that rang with fiddles and laughter last night now moves with quieter purpose. Families in their best coats file into pews, prayer books in hand, their footsteps crisp against the stone steps of churches that rise like sentinels over the neighbourhoods. But look closely and you'll spot familiar faces among them, the very same women who worked the corners and parlours only hours before. A mainstream historical fact. Many prostitutes in 19th century New York attended church regularly. Reformers were baffled, sometimes furious, to see women known for their nighttime work, sitting in pews by day. Some came for genuine faith, others for appearances, and still others for the warmth, music, and sense of belonging that no parlour house could provide. In diaries, ministers admitted their congregations included public women they recognized yet dared not confront. Here's your quirky tidbit. One minister complained in a letter that he could always tell the fallen women by the jingling of jewelry in the pews. Their bracelets, he sniffed, gave them away long before their reputations did. Imagine the irony, trying to sing hymns softly while your bangles keep time louder than the organ. Historians still argue whether church attendance by prostitutes represented a sincere search for redemption or simply a performance of respectability to keep neighbours at bay. Was it faith, camouflage, or both? The answer, like many things in this city, is tangled in the folds of a shawl, pulled just tight enough to hide a face. You step into one such church. The organ hums, the sunlight filters through stained glass, and the congregation sways gently with the rhythm of the hymns. A woman kneels a few rows ahead, her bright dress replaced by a plain calico, her painted cheeks scrubbed raw. She bows her head, lips moving in silent prayer. To the stranger beside her, she's just another worshipper. To you, she's a reminder of last night's gaslit streets. Around you, the congregation whispers. A stern matron glances sideways, her nose wrinkling at the sight of a shawl too thin, a bonnet too fashionable. A young man smirks, nudging his friend, whispering jokes about Saturday's angels turned Sunday saints. Humour seeps into even the holiest places, though the women sit stone still, refusing to respond. The minister's voice rises, condemning sin in sweeping tones without naming names. His words fall heavy, but his eyes skip quickly over certain pews, as though acknowledging the presence of souls he cannot shame away. He preaches about redemption, but the women know that redemption isn't free, and it certainly isn't guaranteed. When the service ends, the women slip out quietly, merging into the flow of respectable families. Some cross themselves and hurry home. Others linger on the steps chatting lightly, perhaps arranging meetings later that evening. The bells toll again, their sound mixing with carriage wheels and children's laughter, as though the city itself is caught between two worlds, sacred and profane, daylight and darkness. As you step back onto the street, the contrast strikes you. Just hours ago, these same women stood in doorways lit by gas lamps, bargaining for coins. Now they blend into a sea of worshippers, their voices raised in hymns instead of laughter. It's not hypocrisy so much as necessity, the delicate dance of survival in a city that demands both piety and indulgence. And so you move on, the sound of bells fading, leaving behind the image of women balancing two worlds on tired shoulders. Pew by day, parlor by night, always caught in the uneasy harmony of New York's restless song. The bells fade behind you, and your feet guide you back toward the clatter of carriage wheels and the sharper accents of commerce. Here lies Wall Street, beating heart of America's 19th century economy, where fortunes rise and fall with the strike of a pen. Men in frock coats hurry past with ledgers under their arms, gold watch chains glinting in the sunlight. They carry the weight of investments, but when evening comes, their ledgers close and their desires open. A mainstream historical fact, many of New York's high-class brothels depended heavily on financiers, bankers, and stock speculators for their clientele. These men, flush with cash from successful trades, or desperate for distraction after disastrous ones, spent evenings in parlor houses where brandy flowed as freely as gossip. Some brothels even mirrored Wall Street's rhythms, busiest after market hours, and eerily quiet when stocks dipped too low. Your quirky tidbit shines like a gold coin. Reformers reported that some madams kept copies of the day's financial news in their parlors. The idea was simple. Clients wanted to read the latest stock quotes while waiting for company, or to impress their companions with sharp talk about markets. Imagine leafing through the Herald's financial section with one hand while sipping champagne with the other, pretending to care about cotton prices while really eyeing the woman across the room. Historians still argue whether these men sought brothels more for the intimacy or for the social networking. Some suggest these houses functioned as informal clubs, where deals were whispered as often as sweet nothings. Others believe the financial elite used them simply as escape valves from the suffocating rules of polite society. In truth, perhaps both are correct. Business and pleasure, often tangled together beneath velvet drapes. You step into one such establishment near Broadway, not far from the stock exchange itself. The parlor smells of cigar smoke and cologne, its furniture heavy with gilt and upholstery. Two bankers lounge on a sofa, debating whether Erie Railroad shares will rise, while a woman in a silk gown leans in, pretending to care about dividends. Her laugh is light, perfectly timed, though you can tell she's heard the same predictions 100 times. In the corner, another scene unfolds. A young broker, clearly rattled, downs glass after glass of brandy. "Lost half my shirt today," he mutters. A courtesan pats his arm and replies smoothly, "Well, darling, you still have the other half." The room erupts in laughter. Humor here isn't just entertainment, it's balm, a way of turning disaster into jest, if only for the night. Outside, the city's pulse beats just as hard. Horses clatter past with carriages filled by men who only hours earlier shouted themselves hoarse on the trading floor. Their collars are loosened now, their eyes scanning for lamplit doorways that promise something softer than the cruel arithmetic of stocks. You catch the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor, mixing strangely with the perfume wafting out of a parlor house. The juxtaposition feels perfectly New York. Finance and flesh, fortunes and failures, oyster shells and velvet curtains all tangled together on the same street. And as you walk on, you realize Wall Street's power isn't confined to the day. Its energy seeps into the city's nights too, fueling an economy that doesn't appear in any ledgers but thrives in shadows nonetheless. The men who gamble with millions by day gamble with their reputations by night, and the women who entertain them know that both markets, stocks and flesh, rise and fall on the same restless tide. You drift away from the polished parlor houses that catered to Wall Street and step into the ink-stained world of New York's newspapers. At every corner, boys cry headlines, waving bundles of damp pages fresh off the press. Their voices rise above the rattle of carriages. Scandal in a Broadway house. Police raid on notorious den. The papers thrive on gossip, feeding a city always hungry for stories of vice and virtue tangled together. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, sensational reporting about prostitution filled columns of penny presses like the New York Herald and the Sun. These stories blended moral outrage with titillation, detailing raids, scandals, and confessions in breathless prose. Circulation soared whenever a headline hinted at lurid detail. Reformers despised the papers for profiting on sin, yet secretly relied on them to spread their warnings. Your quirky tidbit comes from a sly printer's trick. Some papers place scandalous reports on the same page as soap advertisements. Readers could cluck their tongues at fallen women while conveniently noticing a brand that promised to wash away impurity. It was capitalism's wink, turning vice into a marketing opportunity. Historians still argue whether such reporting was more moral crusade or entertainment. Were journalists sincerely trying to reform society, or were they simply selling more papers by dangling scandal? Evidence suggests both. Editors preached purity on one page, then printed every juicy detail of a raid on the next, ensuring readers stayed hooked. You pause at a tavern where men huddle over the latest edition. One slaps the paper and exclaims, "Broadway beauties brought low." His friends laugh, one adding, "They write it like a sermon, but it reads like a novel." The room bursts with amusement, mugs clinking as the scandal becomes tavern entertainment. Stepping back into the street, you glimpse another scene. A young woman hurries past with her shawl pulled tight. Behind her, two newsboys mock-read a headline in sing-song voices, turning her into part of the story without her consent. The cruelty stings sharper than the ink, but no one stops them. In this city, scandal sells and gossip weighs heavier than truth. At a corner stand, you flip through a paper yourself. The column begins solemnly. Our city is imperiled by houses of infamy. But by the third paragraph, the writer lingers on descriptions of velvet curtains, perfumed rooms, and the names of certain notorious ladies. You can almost hear the writer smirking, crafting sentences meant to shock and seduce at the same time. And humour slips in too. A cartoon on the back page mocks a moral reformer caught leaving a brothel, his Bible bulging from his pocket while a courtesan waves him goodbye. The caption reads, "Caught between psalms and sins." Readers roar with laughter, though the message is clear. Hypocrisy, not vice, is the city's favourite target. As the presses clatter through the night, sending out thousands more copies, you realize the newspapers aren't just reporting prostitution, they're shaping it, framing it as both spectacle and shame, fueling conversations that ripple from saloons to parlor houses to reform meetings. Every scandal becomes part of the city's collective theatre, printed in black ink, sold for a penny, and devoured with morning coffee. You tuck the damp newspaper under your arm and follow the trail of whispers it leaves behind. Men at taverns, women at laundries, even cab drivers on corners all repeat the same phrase. Did you read the guide? They're not talking about church tracts or theatre programmes. They mean the sporting guides, the city's unofficial maps of vice, printed and circulated with a wink. The mainstream historical fact, in the 1840s through the 1860s, New York saw the publication of so-called brothel guides, most famously the Gentleman's Directory. These slim volumes listed addresses of houses, described the women, and even rated establishments by quality, pricey, and discretion. They were sold quietly in bookshops or passed hand to hand, turning vice into something shockingly organized. Your quirky tidbit sparkles like ink under lamplight. Some of these guides included literary flourishes comparing certain madams' houses to palaces of Venus, or praising a courtesan's wit as though she were a character in a novel. Imagine flipping through a guide that reads half like a travel book, half like a gossip column, complete with cheeky poetry. One edition even offered walking tours of notorious blocks like a twisted cousin of today's tourist brochures. Historians still argue whether these guides reflected reality or fantasy. Were they accurate maps of the trade, or were they part satire, exaggerating details to amuse wealthy readers? Some scholars suggest the guides inflated the glamour of brothels, making them sound like grand salons rather than cramped houses. Others insist they were deadly accurate, pointing directly to doorways that police somehow never seemed to notice. You picture yourself with one of these slim books in hand, strolling through the gaslit streets. The guide whispers, "Turn left for elegance, right for bargains, straight ahead for discretion." The city unfolds like a carnival map, each house a booth in the fairground of vice. At a saloon, you overhear two men joking. One waves a small pamphlet and declares, "It's cheaper than a map of Central Park." His friend roars, "And twice as useful." The women nearby roll their eyes, but they know the joke carries truth. The guides gave men power to choose, to compare, to consume as if shopping. You flip another imagined page. Descriptions of women are blunt, sometimes cruel, sometimes flowery. One entry praises Miss L, a brunette of lively wit skilled in song. Another dismisses a rival house as too crowded, with girls of poor complexion. The words reduce lives to bullet points, yet they survive as artifacts of a city that catalogued even its shadows. And still you sensed the irony. Reformers handed out tracts to save souls, while publishers printed guides to help men sin more efficiently. Both claimed to be serving the public good. Both relied on paper, ink, and eager readers. As you step away from the imagined pages, the gaslights blur into rows like print on paper. The city itself feels like a guidebook now, every corner annotated with stories, every doorway rated by whispers. You realize that in 19th century New York, vice was not just tolerated, it was indexed, printed, and sold for the price of a cup of coffee, turning the city's most private acts into a very public marketplace. You fold the thought of those cheeky guidebooks into your pocket and drift toward the looming silhouette of City Hall. Its white marble columns gleam faintly under the moonlight, a monument to law and order, or at least the appearance of it. But step closer and you hear whispers slipping through the cracks of those grand stone walls. The truth is simpler and dirtier. Power and profit were often bedfellows, and prostitution in New York thrived not just in shadowed alleys but in smoke-filled back rooms of politics. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, New York's notorious political machine, most famously Tammany Hall, had fingers in nearly every pie of city life, vice included. Brothel owners paid protection money not only to policemen but to aldermen and ward bosses. In return, raids were scheduled like stage plays, carefully timed, to avoid houses that had paid up. Reformers shouted about corruption, but their voices were drowned out by the steady flow of cash. Your quirky tidbit arrives in the form of a joke, popular in the taverns. Don't run for office unless you can run a brothel too. The line carried a sting of truth. One alderman was rumoured to keep a madam on retainer, using her parlour as both a meeting space and a vote-buying operation. Imagine election deals brokered not in council chambers, but in a velvet-draped sitting room with champagne on the sideboard. Historians still argue whether political leaders merely tolerated prostitution for bribes or actively encouraged it as part of their power networks. Some insist Tammany men saw brothels as vital hubs for influence, where deals could be struck in private. Others argue politicians simply closed their eyes in exchange for envelopes stuffed with cash. Either way, the result was the same. Prostitution's survival was woven into the city's political fabric. You picture a smoky room near City Hall, filled with the scent of cigars and spilled brandy. Ward bosses lean over tables, counting ballots and coins alike. A madam enters, her presence as steady as any banker's. She slides an envelope across the table, and a nod seals the bargain. No laws are rewritten, no speeches given, yet the transaction shapes the city more than any debate on the chamber floor. Out in the street, humour runs freely. A newsboy cries, "Honest men for office," and someone yells back, "And who'll run the houses?" Laughter erupts, and you realise cynicism itself has become a kind of civic pastime. The citizens mock the system because they know the system won't change. Walking further, you notice how entwined it all feels. A brothel near Broadway thrives because its madam knows the right alderman. A saloon on the Bowery stays open past curfew because the ward captain drinks there. A police captain looks the other way because his paycheck depends on more than the city's treasury. The web stretches across neighbourhoods, sticky and unbreakable. You pause at City Hall's steps and gaze up at the grand facade. Reformers march here by day, demanding justice, waving petitions. But by night, the building seems quieter, its stone face unreadable. You wonder how many deals were struck inside, how many envelopes passed hand to hand while the city slept, how many women's lives were weighed against the promise of political loyalty. When you step away, the marble glimmers like polished bone, bright but brittle. The building still stands, but you've seen enough to know that beneath its columns lies a foundation less of stone than of secrets, an architecture held together by vice, bribes, and the invisible ink of backroom bargains. You drift away from City Hall's white marble facade, the echo of backroom deals still clinging to your ears, and slip into a darker stretch of the city. Here, the air grows tense, the laughter thinner, edged with danger. In the world of 19th century prostitution, business wasn't simply about silk dresses and candlelit parlours. It was also about violence, muscle, and the ever-present threat of protection rackets. The mainstream historical fact: many prostitutes in New York lived under the thumb of pimps, gangs, or bullies, as they were often called. These men promised protection, but often brought as much harm as safety. Brothels sometimes hired guards, and women working the streets paid part of their earnings to local toughs who ensured they weren't harassed by rivals or robbed by their own clients. It was a precarious bargain, enforced by fists rather than contracts. Your quirky tidbit comes from an arrest record that noted one gang leader carried a club wrapped in newspaper, jokingly calling it his morning edition. He'd wave it around in taverns, threatening anyone who crossed him, insisting his version of the news carried more weight than the Herald. The joke drew laughs, but the bruises it left were no less real. Historians still argue whether these bullies were truly protectors or predators. Some accounts suggest women relied on them for survival in violent neighborhoods, preferring the devil they knew. Others insist pimps and gangs drained women's earnings and trapped them in cycles of dependence. The line between protection and exploitation blurs so heavily it's hard to tell which side of the story leans closer to truth. You walk past a row of cribs near the Bowery, and the atmosphere is taut. Two men argue loudly over territory, their shouts drawing a small crowd. One slams his fist against the wall, declaring, "This block's mine." The other spits back, "Not if my boys have anything to say about it." The women nearby keep their eyes down, accustomed to the ritual, their shoulders tense but unmoving. They know better than to interfere. In another doorway you overhear a joke, sharp and bitter. A woman mutters to her friend, "He calls himself my protector. Funny how I need protection most when he's around." They laugh softly, a humour born from irony, though their smiles fade as a shadow falls across the street and the so-called protector strides past, tipping his hat with mock gallantry. Inside a dim tavern, you witness another form of protection. A madam sits with a gang leader, sliding a stack of coins across the table. He pockets them with a grin, promising her house will remain safe from trouble. She nods, but her hands tremble ever so slightly as she lifts her glass. Safety in this city is never free. It's rented by the week, and the landlord always carries a club. You notice how the cycle feeds itself. Clients sometimes grow violent. Women rely on bullies for help. The bullies, in turn, take a cut so large it leaves the women nearly penniless. To make up the loss, the women return to the streets faster, working harder, which draws more risk. It's a carousel of dependency, spinning endlessly under the gaslight. As you step back into the night air, the city feels heavier, the shadows sharper. Violence here is less spectacle than background noise, always near, always threatening, always humming just beneath the fiddle tunes and drunken laughter. And though the lamplight shines just as brightly as before, you sense that in this part of New York, survival depends not on the glow above, but on the fists lurking in the dark. You walk on from the heavy streets where fists decide survival, and soon you catch quieter sounds, scrubbing brushes, the hum of sewing machines, the soft rhythm of daily labor. Not every woman remained in the trade forever. Some slipped away, carving out second chances that seemed almost miraculous in a city so eager to swallow them whole. A mainstream historical fact. Reform homes, charitable institutions, and even some sympathetic employers offered women paths out of prostitution. A few entered laundries or sewing shops run by missions, others managed to marry clients who saw more than transaction in their encounters, and some simply vanished from the city, leaving behind no trace but a gap in the ledgers of a madam's accounts. Their escapes were rare, fragile, and often temporary, but they happened. Your quirky tidbit comes from a reformer's journal that recorded one woman's rescue story. She supposedly left a brothel, joined a sewing circle, and later married a shoemaker. The reformer triumphantly noted that her wedding dress was made by her own hands, a symbol of redemption. But the same journal also admitted the shoemaker was illiterate, and the couple lived above his workshop in cramped quarters. Still, in the eyes of reformers, a sewing needle and a wedding band outweighed any velvet gown. Historians still argue whether these rescues represented genuine transformation or just rebranding. Did women truly find new lives, or did they simply trade one form of dependency for another, shifting from madams to husbands, from velvet curtains to washboards? Some argue that leaving the trade was rare. Others insist quiet success stories are simply underdocumented, buried beneath scandalous headlines. You step into a laundry where steam rises in clouds and shirts hang from ropes overhead. Women bend over tubs, their arms red from scrubbing. One hums a tune, soft and steady. Her face is lined, but her eyes are calmer than those you saw in the cribs. She left the streets years ago, found steadier work, and though it pays little, the rhythm of clean linen offers her peace. Nearby, a young woman at a sewing machine jokes with her companion. At least the fabric doesn't fight back. They laugh, the humour both sharp and healing, a reminder that survival outside the trade carries its own hardships, but fewer bruises. You overhear another story in a small chapel-turned-mission home. A woman kneels, whispering prayers of thanks not for salvation, but for her new job mending garments. She clutches her shawl tightly, as if the fabric itself is proof she's escaped the cycle. Outside, children run past her, unaware of the life she left behind. And then there are the women who disappear entirely. Neighbors whisper that one girl went west, another married a farmer. Perhaps they reinvented themselves in towns where no one knew their names, perhaps not. The city is filled with gaps like these, absences that leave you wondering whether escape was real or only rumor. As you continue walking, the sound of scrubbing and sewing fades, replaced by the hum of the city. You carry with you the image of women bent over work tables, the smell of soap and starch clinging to their clothes, and the fragile hope that sometimes, just sometimes, New York's night didn't have to last forever. You leave behind the steam of laundries and the soft hum of sewing machines, and soon your steps guide you into neighborhoods where the rhythms shift again. The voices you hear carry different tones, darker, richer, threaded with hymns and laughter that sound unlike the Bowery's din. This is the world of African American women in 19th century New York, where the story of prostitution bent along lines of race as much as class. A mainstream historical fact: African American women, both freeborn and formerly enslaved, made up a visible but often overlooked portion of New York's sex trade. Census records and police reports from the 1850s list colored prostitutes, working in brothels, cribs, and sometimes running small houses of their own. They often faced double stigma, condemned for their work and marginalized for their race, excluded from both reform efforts and the higher-class parlor houses that prized pale skin. Your quirky tidbit comes from a reformer's shocked account that one black madam in the 1860s reportedly offered live music. With every visit, her nephew played the fiddle in the parlor while business went on upstairs. She defended it as hospitality, and some clients even boasted that her house felt more cheerful than its competitors. It was a small but striking way of carving out difference in a crowded market. Historians still argue whether prostitution offered African American women limited independence or only deeper exploitation. Some scholars stress that sex work could be one of the few avenues where black women earned more than in domestic service. Others argue the dangers and discrimination outweighed any advantage, since they were often barred from better-paying houses and more vulnerable to police harassment. The debate remains unsettled, layered with the complexities of race and gender in a city still haunted by slavery's shadow. You wander down a block in Lower Manhattan where black families cluster. Music drifts from a doorway, banjo strings, laughter spilling out into the street. Inside you glimpse a parlor decorated modestly, not with velvet, but with quilts and flowers in chipped vases. Women greet clients with warmth, though you sense the effort it takes to maintain dignity in a society stacked against them. On the stoop outside, a group of men tease each other. One quips, "Better to lose your wages here than at cards." His friend laughs, adding, "At least you get music with your mistakes." Humor here isn't cruel, but knowing, a way of folding hardship into the rhythm of life. Yet the risks are clear. A patrolman walks by, glaring longer than usual, his authority sharper when directed at black neighborhoods. The women's laughter dims until he passes. They know they pay more, risk more, and receive less protection. Still they carry on, weaving survival into every note of music and every candle lit in a window. As you step away, the sound of the fiddle follows you, lingering like a reminder. These women's stories rarely made it into newspapers or reform reports, yet they pulsed at the heart of the city's nights. Forgotten by most, remembered by few, their lives added another verse to New York's restless, complicated song. You leave the quilt-draped parlors of black neighborhoods and follow the faint glow of lanterns that burn redder than most. The air grows heavier with incense and smoke, the streets narrower, the signs overhead written in unfamiliar characters. You've stepped into Chinatown, a small but growing enclave in 19th century New York, and here prostitution takes on another face, shrouded in mystery, misunderstood, and tangled with xenophobia. The mainstream historical fact: by the 1870s and 1880s, Chinese immigrants, mostly men, had settled in Lower Manhattan. Because of immigration restrictions and labor dynamics, very few Chinese women came over, which fueled rumors, fears, and stereotypes. Newspapers claimed Chinese dens trafficked women, describing them as prisoners in hidden rooms. Reformers seized on these tales to paint Chinatown as an exotic nest of vice, though records suggest the actual scale of Chinese-run brothels was small compared to the city's wider trade. Your quirky tidbit peeks from a police report. One Chinatown raid claimed to have freed a woman who then shouted angrily at officers for ruining her livelihood. She supposedly scolded them in 2 languages, waving her fists until they left. The officers didn't know whether to laugh or arrest her twice, and the story circulated as proof that rescues didn't always go as reformers planned. Historians still argue whether Chinese women in New York were mostly trafficked against their will, or whether some came voluntarily, carving out niches in a hostile city. Some accounts describe genuine exploitation, girls brought across the Pacific and sold into debt bondage. Others point to women who navigated survival on their own terms, using the same strategies as Irish, German, or American-born counterparts. The truth, as usual, lies in fragments, distorted by racism and panic. You walk down a narrow lane where lanterns sway in the breeze. A doorway glows faintly, and inside the furnishings are sparse: a low table, a handful of chairs, incense curling into the rafters. A young woman pours tea for 2 men, her gestures careful, her smile practiced. To reformers, this scene might look sinister. To you, it looks like another form of survival dressed in cultural markers outsiders barely understand. Outside, a group of boys jeer, shouting "heathen" and "opium wives." Their cruelty is sharp, fueled by ignorance, but they laugh as though it's clever. Humour, here, is poison disguised as jest, and it cuts deeper than fists. At a nearby corner, reformers hold lanterns of their own, preparing for another raid. They whisper about underground tunnels and locked rooms, stories that sound more like ghost tales than evidence. You wonder how much is real and how much is projection, fears of the foreign painted over familiar patterns of vice. As you leave Chinatown, the lanterns fade behind you, their red glow swallowed by the wider city. You carry with you the sense of how easily rumor can shape reality, how whole communities can be defined not by truth, but by stories whispered in reform meetings and printed in headlines. The women of these parlors remain largely voiceless in the record, but their presence lingers, part of New York's restless underworld, half seen and half invented. The red lanterns of Chinatown fade behind you, and a new sound rises in their place. The roll of drums, the call of bugles, the shuffle of boots against cobblestones. The Civil War has come to New York, and with it, thousands of soldiers on leave. The city swells with uniforms, blue coats crowding taverns, barracks spilling men into the streets. Wherever armies gather, prostitution flourishes, and New York's brothels and cribs thrum with new business. A mainstream historical fact. During the 1860s, New York became a hub for Union soldiers, many of them young, restless, and far from home. Paydays brought surges of customers into brothels across the city. Reformers complained bitterly that soldiers carried disease back to their regiments, and medical reports from the time confirm high rates of syphilis and gonorrhea among the Union Army. The city became, in one reformer's grim phrase, a military camp of vice. Your quirky tidbit comes from a diary entry by a young recruit who wrote that visiting a brothel was cheaper than whiskey and warmer than blankets. His words, flippant yet telling, reveal how soldiers treated such visits as part of their leave, almost as routine as buying tobacco. Some regiments even had jokes about which brothel belonged to their company, as if each had adopted a house like a mascot. Historians still argue whether the war amplified prostitution or simply shifted its clientele. Some claim the surge of soldiers overwhelmed the city, while others argue business merely changed hands. Merchants one week, soldiers the next. Either way, the war turned New York's Vice District into a bustling carnival of uniforms and muskets stacked outside doorways. You follow the sound of marching boots into a tavern where the air is thick with smoke and laughter. Soldiers crowd the bar, slapping each other on the back, their muskets propped carelessly in the corner. Women weave through the crowd, some wearing ribbons in Union blue, a patriotic flourish that doubles as advertisement. One soldier jokes, "Even the ladies fight for the Union, just in their own way." The room roars with laughter, mugs clinking as if the war itself were being won in this smoky hall. You step into a side room where the noise softens. A woman sits across from a soldier barely older than 16, his cheeks flushed, his voice trembling. She holds his hand, listening as he talks about his home in Ohio, the farm he left behind, the brother who didn't return from battle. For a moment it feels less like a transaction and more like solace, human comfort pressed between the cracks of war. Outside, the city pulses with contradictions. On one block, reformers march in protest, declaring the army dishonored by vice. On the next, soldiers pour out of brothels, their laughter mixing with bugle calls. A street preacher cries doom, a tavern fiddler drowns him out, and humor, as always, thrives. You hear a soldier boast to his comrades, "I survived Gettysburg, boys, but I might not survive this street." They laugh so hard one nearly drops his cap. The joke is grim, but it rings true. The dangers of war and the dangers of pleasure blending until neither can be separated. As you leave the clamor behind, the city feels swollen, stretched by the weight of war and want. The bugles fade, the laughter lingers, and you sense how New York in the Civil War years became not just a city of soldiers, but a battlefield of bodies, desires, and survival in its own right. The bugles fade into memory, and your path winds toward quieter streets where the glow of oil lamps flickers softly through plain wooden doors. The laughter of taverns has ebbed, replaced by the low murmur of hymns, the scrape of chairs on bare floors, and the rustle of fabric as women bend over sewing tables. These are the reform homes, half sanctuary, half prison, where fallen women were sent, coaxed, or dragged to be reshaped into something society found acceptable. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, institutions such as the House of Mercy or the Magdalen Asylum dotted New York, run mostly by religious groups. They promised to reform prostitutes through discipline, prayer, and honest labor. Women in these homes rose at dawn, scrubbed floors, sewed garments, and memorized scripture. Some stayed willingly, grateful for food and shelter. Others chafed under strict rules, sneaking out when they could, only to return to the streets. Your quirky tidbit comes from a reformer's diary that described teaching sewing to a group of women who insisted on stitching hidden messages into the hems. Phrases like "pray for me," or even cheeky notes like "send wine," showed up on garments meant for charity. The reformers were scandalized, but the women laughed among themselves, finding a way to rebel with needle and thread. Historians still argue whether reform homes genuinely saved lives or merely imposed middle-class morality. Were they sanctuaries offering a true second chance, or workhouses cloaked in religious zeal? Some point to success stories of women who left to marry or find steady work. Others see the homes as places of confinement, where individuality was scrubbed as harshly as the laundry. You walk into one such mission. The room is spare, whitewashed walls, a cross nailed above the lectern, a faint smell of starch and soap. Women sit in rows, stitching quietly, their shawls plain, their hair neatly braided. A matron paces between them, her shoes clicking against the floor, reminding them to sit straighter, to pray silently as they sew. Yet you catch glimpses of small rebellions. One woman hums a tavern tune under her breath. Another smirks when the matron's back is turned. A third pricks her finger, mutters something sharp, and earns a muffled laugh from the row. Even here, humor refuses to die. Later in the chapel, the women kneel side by side. The minister speaks of redemption, his voice rising like a hymn. Some close their eyes in genuine prayer. Others stare blankly at the floor, lips still. And you realize that salvation, like sin, cannot be forced. It flickers only where it chooses to catch. When the service ends, the women file out into dormitories where iron cots line the walls. The lamps dim, the singing fades, and silence settles like dust. Some will stay, bending themselves into the shape reformers demand. Others will slip away at dawn, the city's gaslight calling them back. You step outside, the night air cool after the closed rooms. Behind you, the mission stands quiet, its windows shuttered. Ahead, the city hums restlessly, its brothels and taverns alive again. The reform homes hold steady like little islands of order, but you know how easily the tide sweeps women back into the streets, leaving their sewing needles behind like forgotten prayers. The reform homes' shuttered windows fade behind you, and soon your ears catch a livelier pulse. Fiddles shriek, boots stomp, mugs slam against wooden tables. You've wandered into the Bowery, a district that thrums with energy after dark, where beer halls, dance saloons, and cheap theatres spill laughter and music into the street. If Broadway is polished, the Bowery is ragged, and that raggedness makes it irresistible. A mainstream historical fact. The Bowery, in the mid to late 19th century, was the city's entertainment hub for the working class. Cheap saloons, dime museums, and music halls drew crowds of sailors, apprentices, and laborers. Prostitution was woven into the scene. Women mingled freely with men at beer tables, while upstairs rooms or back alleys provided privacy for those who wanted more than music. Reformers loathed the Bowery, calling it the sink of the city. Your quirky tidbit jingles with coins. Many Bowery dance halls charged men 5 cents a dance ticket. The tickets were handed to women who collected them like currency. A popular joke went, 2 dances buy you a kiss, 10 buy you a room. No one wrote this in official ledgers, but everyone in the hall knew the math. Historians still argue whether the Bowery was primarily a zone of exploitation or a rare space of freedom. Some describe the women as preyed upon, hemmed in by poverty and booze. Others suggest the Bowery offered women unusual autonomy they could earn directly from tickets and tips, choosing whom to humour and whom to brush off. The truth, once again, shifts like shadows under the gaslight. You push open the door of a dance hall and the scene hits you in waves, fiddlers scraping wildly, the smell of spilled beer, sawdust crunching underfoot. Men whirl women around the floor, boots scuffing so hard the boards groan. One woman laughs so loudly her hat tumbles off, another clutches her skirts, shrieking with delight as her partner spins her too fast. The noise is so thick it feels like a living creature. At a table nearby you overhear banter. A dock worker brags, "I've got 5 tickets, guess I'm rich tonight." His friend shoots back, "Rich? You'll be broke before you finish your pint." They laugh, and even the woman collecting the tickets smirks, pocketing them with practiced fingers. Humour is the Bowery's currency, as common as beer foam and just as fleeting. But step outside the music for a moment, and the Bowery's other rhythm reveals itself. In the alley behind the hall, couples slip into shadows, transactions quick and quiet. A bouncer leans against the wall, arms crossed, making sure nothing gets out of hand, unless, of course, someone forgets to pay their share. The Bowery may be chaotic, but it has its rules. Back inside, the music reaches a fever pitch. A fiddler breaks a string, curses loudly, and earns a roar of laughter from the crowd. Someone shouts for another round, coins scatter, mugs slam again. The whole room tilts and sways as though the Bowery itself is a ship and everyone inside just passengers on its wild ride. When you step out at last, the street feels almost as noisy as the hall. Hawkers shout about oysters, newsboys cry headlines, and laughter tumbles out of every doorway. The Bowery hums like a living thing, and you realize why reformers hated it so much. It was too alive, too noisy, too resistant to control. In every jig step and every clink of a beer mug, the Bowery declared that it belonged to no one but itself. The Bowery's fiddles fade behind you, but the rhythm of voices lingers, this time softer, inkier, dripping from pens onto paper. For as much as reformers raged and preachers scolded, another set of eyes was watching New York's underworld. Writers and artists, some came to condemn, others to romanticize, and still others simply to sketch what they saw with equal parts fascination and dread. A mainstream historical fact, newspapers, dime novels, and even social studies of the 19th century often featured prostitutes as characters, sometimes tragic, sometimes scandalous. Writers like George Foster penned New York by gaslight, guiding readers through alleys and brothels with a mix of voyeurism and moralizing. Artists, too, sketched scenes of bawdy houses and taverns, often for satirical magazines that thrived on caricature. Your quirky tidbit flickers from an easel. One caricaturist in the 1850s famously drew brothel interiors with such exaggeration, women in gowns 3 sizes too large, clients with noses like turnips, that readers laughed at the absurdity while still recognizing the truth beneath. The sketches were so popular that bootleg copies circulated on street corners, passed hand to hand like forbidden candy. Historians still argue whether such depictions reinforced stigma or gave prostitutes a strange kind of visibility. Did writers and artists make these women more human by telling their stories, or did they flatten them into symbols of vice? The debate is as layered as the ink itself, condemnation and curiosity tangled on the same page. You pause at a print shop, where engravings hang in the window. One shows a dim parlour, a woman leaning across a piano as a man whispers in her ear. The caption reads, "Society's Shadow." A passerby chuckles and mutters, "Looks more like my cousin's wedding." Humour punctures the solemn tone, proof that audiences consumed these works with equal parts seriousness and jest. Further down the street, you step into a tavern where a journalist scratches notes by candlelight. He listens to the banter around him, the sailors boasting, the women laughing, and scribbles furiously. His column tomorrow will drip with adjectives: riotous, shameless, intoxicating. You imagine readers over breakfast half clutching their pearls, half leaning closer to catch every detail. You hear another kind of humor at the bar. A woman teases a sketch artist posing dramatically. "Don't forget my good side," he laughs and replies, "Which one is that?" The room bursts into laughter, though she still insists he draw her necklace twice as large. Even reform literature leaned on artistry. Tracts describe brothels in such vivid terms, velvet curtains, perfumes, candlelight, that one critic grumbled, "They'd describe sin better than poets describe love." The line became a running joke, repeated in coffee houses where readers winked over sermons meant to scare them straight. As you walk on, you imagine the city itself as a sketchbook, its streets filled with penciled outlines and splashes of ink. Every doorway becomes a vignette, every candlelit room a scene waiting for a caption. The artists may exaggerate, the writers may moralize, but together they weave the tapestry that ensures New York's nights live on long after the candles burn out. You leave behind the ink-stained taverns and enter a quieter street where voices carry differently, higher, firmer, touched with urgency. Here, not reformers with umbrellas, but women themselves are speaking. The words are cautious, sometimes whispered, but they gather strength in parlors and lecture halls. For the first time, you hear early feminist voices shaping the story of prostitution in 19th century New York. A mainstream historical fact. By the mid to late 1800s, women's rights activists like Victoria Woodhull and members of suffrage movements began to address prostitution directly. Some framed it as a symptom of women's lack of economic power, arguing that until women had equal access to wages, education, and property, prostitution would remain a grim necessity. Others condemned it outright as moral degradation. The conversation fractured, but it existed, and that alone was revolutionary. Your quirky tidbit comes from an 1871 lecture where Woodhull, herself no stranger to scandal, declared that prostitution is the child of marriage without love. The audience gasped, newspapers howled, and caricatures of her appeared in satirical weeklies. Yet her words planted seeds, making people wonder if the fallen woman was not the disease but the symptom. Historians still argue whether these early feminist interventions genuinely shifted public debate or were drowned out by louder reformers and moralists. Some credit activists with reframing prostitution as an issue of inequality, not just sin. Others suggest their voices were too few, too radical, and too easily silenced by ridicule. The debate lingers, unresolved, like an unfinished speech. You step into a small hall where wooden chairs creak under the weight of women in shawls and bonnets. At the front, a speaker reads from a pamphlet about the traffic in women. Her words tremble at first, but soon they steady. She demands better wages for seamstresses, safer factories, schools for girls. She argues that no woman should be forced to sell her body to live. The audience murmurs, some nodding, others shifting uneasily. At the back, a man snickers, whispering to his friend, "She wants us all to marry our maids." The joke earns a stifled laugh, proof that even in earnest debates, humour sneaks in to puncture seriousness. The women ignore him, pressing forward with their vision. Outside, you overhear more banter. A newsboy cries, "Feminists want higher pay." And a man shouts back, "So they can charge us double." The crowd chuckles, but you sense the tension beneath, the unease of a society asked to rethink its rules. As you walk away, the words echo in your ears. These early feminists did not end prostitution, nor did they agree on how to view it, but they cracked open the conversation, pointing fingers not only at women in doorways, but at the entire structure of society, its wages, its marriages, its hypocrisies. Their voices were scattered, sometimes mocked, often ignored, yet they linger still, woven into the chorus of the city's restless nights. The small lecture hall fades behind you, and the night air feels heavier, as though the city itself is exhaling after decades of noise. You sense a shift, less laughter spilling from taverns, fewer carriages pulling up outside parlour houses, more shuttered windows where once candles burned late. The trade hasn't vanished, of course, but its open flourish begins to dim. New York is changing, and prostitution's long, brazen parade starts its slow decline. A mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, a mix of forces pressed against the sex trade. Police crackdowns grew more frequent, reform societies louder, and public tolerance thinner. Waves of immigration reshaped neighborhoods, pushing brothels further into the margins. The rise of tenement housing and factory jobs offered women alternative, if meager, livelihoods. And sensational trials splashed across newspapers made clients more cautious, afraid of scandal. Your quirky tidbit drifts from the courtroom. One 1880s trial against a madam drew such a crowd that vendors sold peanuts outside, as if it were a theatre show. People joked it was the cheapest ticket to scandal in town. The laughter masked the truth that curiosity remained even as public appetite for tolerance waned. Historians still argue whether this decline was truly moral reform at work or merely a shift in fashion. Did people genuinely grow more virtuous, or did they simply demand their vices be hidden better? Some scholars suggest prostitution didn't shrink but rather scattered, fragmenting into more secretive arrangements like private apartments or discreet assignation houses. The debate remains unsettled, like footsteps echoing in an empty corridor. You walk past a row of once busy houses. Their curtains are drawn, their brass knockers polished but untouched. The air feels quieter, the shadows thicker. A woman in plain dress sweeps her stoop, her posture more neighborly than inviting. You sense the transformation. What was once open spectacle now hides behind respectability's mask. Still, humor lingers in the cracks. In a Bowery saloon, a man mutters, "Brothels are vanishing? Only from the guidebooks, not from the streets." His friend chuckles. The city just traded gaslight for whispers. The room roars with laughter, though the joke carries the sting of truth. You stop at a corner where once you saw bright dresses and heard fiddles. Tonight, only the faint hiss of a gas lamp and the shuffle of a stray dog keep you company. The city feels restless, as if it misses its own chaos, yet strains toward a new respectability demanded by reformers and politicians alike. Walking on, you realize the decline isn't clean or final. Some houses adapt, dressing themselves as boarding houses or private clubs. Others vanish, their names forgotten. Yet the memory clings to the bricks, to the cobblestones, to the very air of the streets. New York cannot erase what it once embraced. It can only bury it under layers of silence and new facades. The streets grow quieter now, as though the city itself is settling into uneasy slumber. Where once fiddles scraped and sailors laughed, you hear only the soft shuffle of boots and the sigh of wind through alleyways. The parlor houses have dimmed, the cribs shuttered, the Bowery's dance floors less crowded than before. Yet the memory of those nights lingers, refusing to be swept away like dust from the stoops. A mainstream historical fact. By the end of the 19th century, New York had shifted its vice districts out of the open, tucking prostitution deeper into hidden apartments, secret clubs, and coded advertisements. The flamboyance of gaslit brothels gave way to discretion, and reformers claimed victory. But the truth was more complicated. Demand never ceased, and the women who had lived in the city's shadows remained, even if their names faded from the record. Your quirky tidbit whispers from an old pamphlet. One reformer wrote that he was haunted by the ghosts of women who never had gravestones. He claimed he saw their faces in every flicker of gaslight and every closed curtain. The words were meant to stir sympathy, but they carry a strange poetry, suggesting that even then people knew these lives would vanish into history's blind spots. Historians still argue whether prostitution's decline marked progress or just another cycle of concealment. Did reform truly change lives, or did it merely shift vice to new corners where records grew scarcer? Was it victory, or just silence? The answer drifts like smoke, impossible to catch, lingering but never clear. You pause at the edge of the city's restless heart and imagine all the women whose footsteps once echoed here. Some laughed in velvet parlours, others huddled in cribs with a single candle. Some stitched hems in reform homes, some poured brandy for bankers, some slipped west to start anew. Their names may not be carved in stone, but their presence shaped the city as much as any merchant or mayor. On a stoop, you overhear one last piece of humour, gentle this time. An old man mutters, "New York cleaned its streets, just don't look in the basements." A few nearby laugh, weary but knowing. Even jokes can carry memory, ensuring nothing vanishes completely. And so you walk on, the gas lamps hissing softly overhead, the city quieter now, but never still. Behind every shuttered window lies a story. Behind every silence, a voice once raised in laughter, in song, in survival. The forgotten women of 19th century New York linger in the air, invisible but undeniable, woven into the city's endless fabric. Now the streets are still. The city you've wandered through, its alleys, parlours, taverns and stoops, slows to a murmur like a tide ebbing back into the sea. The sharp edges of scandal, the cries of newsboys, even the fiddles of the Bowery all soften into memory. What remains are quieter images, a shawl drawn against the cold, a lamp flickering in a dusty window, a laugh shared between strangers who needed it to carry on. You can picture it gently now, as if through frosted glass. The women who lived these lives are no longer rushing, no longer bargaining or hiding. Their footsteps fade, their voices hush, and the city folds them back into itself with something almost like tenderness. Even the reformers' umbrellas, the policeman's bribes, the banker's boasts, all of it quiets like distant echoes pressed under a blanket of time. As you breathe slower, imagine the lamps dimming one by one, each hiss of gas like a soft exhale. Streets empty, curtains close, the noise becomes a low hum, not demanding attention, but lulling you instead. The stories remain, yes, but they settle now, resting like shadows at the edge of your thoughts. Let your body ease into stillness, your mind soften around the edges. The city is at rest, and so are you. Drift with the silence, knowing you've walked through history's hidden corners, and nothing more is required of you tonight. Just quiet, just calm, just sleep.